So in this video, I'm just going to kind of just talk basically, like we would on the first day of class, and just talk about what ecological economics is. So, I've got slides and informal slides and whatnot for chapter one, right, and where we do kind of the more um, formal discussion. But based on this second reading, which was environmental economics and ecological economics, where can they converge, which is your kind of general introduction to what ecological economics is, that's going to be kind of what I'm talking about here without formally talking about the article. It's an 18-page article. It's not that difficult of a read, but that gives you an introduction just as chapter one does. But let me just kind of talk about things. So ecological economics is not the same thing as environmental economics. That's a key distinguishing point right there. It, environmental economics as a field would be the kind of class you could take at almost any undergraduate institution. And essentially, it's an applied microeconomics course. What environmental economics involves is it's really a focus of, as I see it, as two chapters from your Principles of Microeconomics textbook. That would be the chapter that's usually chapter two, the one where we talk about the production possibilities frontier. And we talk about how an economy can get closer, be more efficient, and be closer to the frontier itself. And the other chapter that environmental economics focuses on is the government intervention, externality, market failure set of readings. And that would be where we talk about their existing externalities, things that are external costs or external benefits that are not seen by the people that are actually causing the costs or getting the benefits. An example would be, if I smoke cigarettes, it creates a negative externality of pollution, right? Or more specifically for environmental economics, if I'm generating electricity and I have a coal burning power plant, I'm generating both air and water pollution to produce that electricity. And I, as the company, because I'm generating these negative externalities, these external costs, I would tend to overproduce coal-fired generated electricity because I'm not bearing the costs of the pollution. And so then what we do in environmental economics is we talk about ways to internalize those costs. That we can internalize, for instance, a negative externality with government regulation. You can internalize external costs by imposing taxes, or you can internalize external costs with tradable permits. For positive externalities, which we also do have, so I'm here in the state of Hawaii, and one of the things they want to do is they want there to be more of an appreciation of the natural resources that we have here and try to stop some of the over-tourism. That one way we could read that over-tourism is that it's an external cost, but another way to say it would be is that there's a natural beauty here on the islands, and that there's a benefit to that. There's benefits that come from appreciating that natural beauty that are outside of any private capture of those benefits. And so maybe we would just try to find ways to charge people for those extra benefits that they're getting. And you would do, like what they call here a green tax, something to protect the environment as a reflection of those benefits that exist. Now, what about ecological economics, and how is that different than environmental economics? So in environmental economics, really our focus here is to focus on efficiency. In environmental economics, our focus is on how do we remove market failures to get closer to those efficient standpoints. It's all about efficiency, though. That's what makes it an applied microeconomics field. Ecological economics, which is obviously the focus of this course, is different. It's different because largely what has to happen is that it doesn't contain itself entirely within the field of economics. It draws from other disciplines. And when that happens, generally economists are not going to study it as much because it involves them knowing things outside of their field, which generally they're not going to do, generally speaking. Whereas environmental economics, we can date back the discussion of externalities and PPFs and whatnot back to the 1880s, 1870s, 1880s. Ecological economics really becomes its own independent field, largely at the end of the 1970s, early 1980s. And it starts with a book that actually was the reason why I wanted to teach this course. I had a little bit of a story time here. I had a professor who in undergraduate, like I treated as kind of like one of my mentors. He had gone to graduate school in the 1970s. And in the 1970s, people were really concerned about nuclear power and the dangers of nuclear power, generating electric through the splitting of atoms. And he's very committed to that environmental cause. And he had all of us in the class read a book. That book was called Small is Beautiful. And it was by E.F. Schumacher. And I'll tell you, it was one of those books I read as an undergraduate that really changed my perspective on things. It's a really good book. And while we're not going to be like focusing, we'll get to some point here later where we'll still talk about the author, but largely because I just really like his writing, E.F. Schumacher. But the book Small is Beautiful is just a wonderful book. And what it does is it talks about how the discipline of economics would be different if people and their value system played a more prominent role than just this pursuit of efficiency, which we see in a typical environmental economics discussion. And the Small is Beautiful text that was written in 1973, it kind of simmered. It kind of, and there were a few other economists besides Schumacher, primarily Herman Daly, who's the author, one of the co-authors of the textbook that we're using in this course, where they then realized, okay, we need to create this new field of ecological economics. Let's write a textbook. Let's start a research agenda. Let's start a scholarly society. All the things that you do to create an independent field of study like ecological economics. So you get the International Society for Ecological Economics in 1989. And then that scholarly society ends up publishing the journal Ecological Economics. And so, right, then and then you start running conferences and you do all the things to kind of establish your field, build up your discipline. And again, you're going to focus on the idea of how ecological economics is different than environmental economics. The thing about Small is Beautiful, let's just start with that. thing about Small is Beautiful is that what it did is, and I admittedly, I'm Catholic, so I don't know, us Catholics don't generally learn a lot about other religions. We kind of just stick in our own narrow fields, and so it makes me sound like I'm a little bit closed-minded here. I'm not closed-minded to what others believe. It's just I don't know very much because it's exhausting enough just to learn about Catholicism, let alone having to learn about Buddhism, which features more prominently here in the Small is Beautiful book. But the idea in Buddhism, as I very vaguely understand it, would be this idea that, right, everything matters, everything has value. Um, People have values, but also other aspects of the environment have value, and that there's this natural harmony that exists in the environment that leads to happiness and satisfaction. And and that there's some value that comes from, being close to nature, and that there's some value that comes in ways other than just accumulating more wealth and more income. And so that's in some sense the essence of The Small is Beautiful and that Buddhist economics text. But what that all does is it pushes ecological economics away from a strict economics, right? Because the kind of economics that you learn in principles, or at least even what if you took, for instance, Econ 202 with me, the macro course or even the micro course, what you'll see is that, we don't talk a lot about what other fields are doing, like the Marxists and the Austrians or the Keynesians. We stick pretty close to a field of economic thought that emerged starting in the 1870s called neoclassical economic thought, which another way of saying it would be mainstream economic thought. You have to look pretty far and wide to find economists that are doing economics other than mainstream economics, neoclassical economics. Now, we're somewhat unique at Eastern Oregon in that we have two of us, myself um, and Scott McConnell, who's not a dean but also an economist, who do a little bit more what we would call heterodox or non-mainstream economics. Um, but the idea is that ecological economics is where these alternative theories, these alternative ways of looking at economics can exist. So one thing you're going to find a great deal in this course is that all the confidence that you got in learning the economics that you did, the economic models that you did, pretty much after pretty close to after chapter 1, and then this little bit here, chapter 10, chapter 2, chapter 3, pretty much after that, we're going to move away from the mainstream economic thought. Now, what does that mean for us? It means for us that in ecological economics, we're going to learn a little bit more at times about religion. We're going to learn a little bit more about science in terms of like geochemical cycles and whatnot. We'll learn a lot more about ethics, which obviously economics, traditional economics, stays pretty far away from. We'll look at these notions of sustainability, and what is it that sustainability really means. And then we'll also look at this kind of debate between growing an economy versus how to make an economy sustainable over time. And we'll de-emphasize our discussion of just looking at environmental problems as externalities, that it's much more complicated than that. And that's really the essence, as I kind of wrap up my conclusionary comments here, that's really the essence of how I see ecological economics. That it reflects the reality that environmental problems are complex, so our discussion of them and our attempt to resolve them should also be complex. That it's not, my argument for why you wouldn't want to be just an environmental economist is that for an environmental economist, they see the world in terms of externalities. Every problem that exists is seen as a market failure, and that all you then have to do is focus your attention on how to fix that market failure. And I just think, I thoroughly believe, after 47 years of my life, that the world is not as simple, it's not as black and white, that things can be resolved as simply as just saying, a market failure caused a problem, so let's fix it. And that's a lot of what we'll see in this course after week 2. And so what you'll see is that these complex problems that we're talking about in each of these chapters are going to be more complex. You're not going to feel as certain as you do when you finish a chapter in a standard economics textbook that you think you know what the answers are. That will not be the case here. After we get past week 2, you might find yourself most of the time just feeling more confused than when you started. And all I can really say to you is, no, that's okay. It is, in some sense, part of the essence of what we'll be doing in this course. Okay, so with that all said, then, as our kind of introduction to what is ecological economics and how is it, in some sense, a little bit different than standard economics, what we then will just start with here is chapter 1. So I'll make this as a separate lecture. This is kind of a chapter that we would do if you hadn't taken a principles class in quite a long time, or if possibly you're someone who hasn't taken one ever. That would be kind of the essence of this chapter 1. So this will seem like a pretty simple, pretty much a review kind of chapter. Okay.